Um, Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, Hurricane Katrina at 20, Looking Back and Moving Forward. My name is Anna Canny. I'm the Science Communications Lead here at the Natural Hazard Center at University of Colorado Boulder, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. I'm joined here by some authors from the Katrina Bookshelf, and they'll have a chance to introduce themselves in a minute, and we'll have a great conversation. So before we get started on that, I wanted to just go over a couple of housekeeping things. We will record today's webinar. We're already recording. And so if you know folks who weren't able to make it, or if you want to refer back to it later, it'll be up on our website, likely first thing Monday. So we'll have a video recording that you can go back to. I also want to direct you to the Q&A. I'll be monitoring that throughout the chat. We're going to talk for about an hour, and we'll have a bit of time at the end for questions. So you can drop them there as they come to you. But on that note, many of you already submitted some great questions via the registration, and so just want to acknowledge that they were really insightful, and we use many of those to inform the direction of our conversation today. So hopefully we'll get to a lot of those as we're talking. And one of the questions we also asked that I just wanted to acknowledge really quickly is the motivation for joining today's webinar. And so many people had personal connections about Katrina, whether you survived it yourself, you had family members who survived it, you were in New Orleans as a volunteer or a first responder. I was just really struck by those responses and how much this disaster motivated a lot of people in the room here today personally to develop an interest in disaster studies. So that's just one of the reasons we wanted to mark today's anniversary. But yeah, thank you so much for sharing those personal stories. So a little more about our conversation today and why we wanted to mark today's anniversary. So as you likely all know, today marks 20 years since Hurricane Katrina made landfall, and it's one of the most important turning point disasters in our national history. 1,833 people perished, 1.2 million people were displaced, and countless more people were affected in significant ways across all sectors of life. So it profoundly reshaped disaster research and emergency management policy and practice as well. And I just want to give a few examples of that. It's one of the most studied disasters across all disciplines in our national history, and it triggered a lot of extensive work, including the groundbreaking failure investigation known as the Interagency Performance Evaluation Task Force, or IPAT, that examined New Orleans, the hurricane protection system there. Katrina also led to the passage of the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Act in 2006, which changed a lot about the Federal Emergency Management Agency. It gave FEMA greater flexibility and clear authority under the Department of Homeland Security, and it also required that the FEMA administrator have an emergency management background, which might surprise you that wasn't a requirement before. It also established a disability coordinator office at FEMA, and those are just a few examples, but there are myriad reasons why we're here today to observe this anniversary. And so I want to just call attention to there's an incredible amount of work that followed Katrina, and to narrow the scope of today's conversation and really make it focused, we decided to organize today's webinar around the Katrina Bookshelf. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. I also want to acknowledge this was partially inspired by a panel we had at this year's 50th annual workshop about disasters as turning points. I believe Lori will drop that in the chat, but we talked about a bunch of disasters that really changed the field, and Katrina was on that panel, but one of the things we learned from the audience was just how profoundly this particular disaster reshaped our field, and so we wanted to dedicate a bit more time to it. As I mentioned, the Katrina Bookshelf. The Katrina Bookshelf is a collection of books that we'll be talking about today, edited by Kai Erikson of Yale University, and it was published by the University of Texas Press. And it is one of the most comprehensive collections we have of social science coverage on a single disaster. And the series brings together authors, some of whom are with us today, with a wide range of perspectives on topics in social science. So there are 8 books total, and they touch on everything from cultural trauma to the storm's impact on children. And again, I just really want to underscore and acknowledge at the outset here that there are thousands of studies on Katrina in engineering and physical science and the humanities and public health, and really all fields that have helped to advance our understanding of the storm's legacy. Scholars from all different types of backgrounds have shed light on everything from why the levees failed to how systematic racism shaped the disaster. And in this webinar, even though we'll just be highlighting the Katrina Bookshelf as one national effort, I do want to encourage everyone in the room to be mindful of all of the literature that's out there about Katrina and its legacy. So we are joined, as I mentioned, by some of the authors of the Katrina Bookshelf here today. And so I'm going to turn it over to them and ask them each to take just 3 minutes, and I will be timing to kind of keep us on track, to introduce your book and its methodology and a couple of key takeaways that still feel relevant now that we're 20 years on from Katrina. So I will start with Jackie Litt, and her book is Displace, or she contributed to the book Displace, many authors did, and it's Displace: A Life in the Katrina Diaspora. So Jackie, if you want to start us off.
Thank you. I'm busy setting my alarm so I don't go over. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Lori and Anna, for setting up this panel. I'm very excited that we're acknowledging the importance of the day and getting to catch up on where the research is and where it needs to go. I also want to start by acknowledging Lynn Weber. I know Lori mentioned her. She was part of our Katrina network, research network, and was a really key member, and very suddenly she died, and it was a real tragedy. So this is in honor of her. So the book, Displaced, is a compilation of reports produced by 12 researchers who came together shortly after the disaster. And I can talk about how we built that later. But for now, I'll just say that the works together provided a singular focus on the effects of Hurricane Katrina through a critical intersectional approach. That you'll hear me say this again and again, that highlighted power, privilege, and intersectionality. There are many differences among the folks on the network, but I believe they were all academics. Those who published here, 6 were from New Orleans and 6 were from evacuee sites, like me. I was in Missouri at the time, and we many evacuees emerged in Missouri, Columbia, Missouri. So the 2 takeaways, do you have questions? No. The 2 takeaways I would say, and Lori might well say something else, is the magnitude of the internal involuntary forced displacement. It was really like nothing I'd ever seen in the United States. I do study a little bit globally, but this was sort of almost in an instant. Many people who couldn't leave, or even who could, were displaced from their traditional ties. And I think a takeaway from the book taken together is the really absolute destruction of the social organization that knit together communities, informal and formal social networks, and kin networks. And I have studied poverty much of my life. That is before I went into administration almost 20 years ago. But I've seen dislocation in impoverished neighborhoods. But of course, nothing like this, because the basic structure of their lives was just basically blown up. That's my time. Okay. And I would say, aside from displacement, and the power of that, how difficult it was to resettle. Because the barrier of transportation, jobs, medical care, housing, the high prices in New Orleans, the lack of the social organization, especially of social networks, made it very, very difficult to resettle. So my time's up already. I'll
It's,
stop.
we will have more time to talk about
Okay.
all the books in the collection. So I wanted to quickly, I know Lori was a co-editor on that book as well. So
Yes, of
with Lori.
course.
So Lori, is there anything you'd like to add on Displaced before we move on to the next book in the collection?
Well, thank you. Well, first, I just want to join Jackie in acknowledging Lynn Weber, who served as the lead editor of this effort and an extraordinary scholar and advocate and activist. And she actually died due to COVID-19. And one of her last missives that she sent from the hospital bed was related to she was observing, lived in South Carolina and observing the care work that was occurring all around her, and the women in particular who were taking on that care work, which is also, I think, really an important thread throughout Displaced as well. So I just also wanted to uplift and honor Lynn's name, and I wanted to honor Jackie because it was actually Jackie from her perch in Missouri who, as evacuees were both forcibly relocated there, placed on buses and otherwise moved to Missouri or voluntarily relocated there, that Jackie reached out to Kai Erikson, the lead of this entire effort, and said, what's happening around the displacement? This is the largest forced mass displacement in modern US history. And Kai said, I'm not sure. Would you help find the people? And it was Jackie Litt who brought us together, including Pam Jenkins, who was a member of the core 12th of us, all feminist scholars who Jackie helped bring together for this network on displaced persons. So I really wanted to uplift their leadership and role. And I think that the last key takeaway I would add on top of everything Jackie said was that I think one of the powerful things about Displaced in our network is about half of us were in New Orleans or had lived in New Orleans at the time of the storm and were displaced or remained there, like Pam Jenkins. And so kind of half of our network, we were in New Orleans, we're studying what was happening with that dynamic return to the city, what was going on in the city. And half of us were outside of the city. Jackie in Missouri, Lynn in South Carolina, Lee in Texas, me in Colorado, Alice in Vermont, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the things we were able to observe was that process over the long term of what was happening on the ground in New Orleans as people attempted to return to the city and make a life, but then also what was happening in the receiving, what we came to call the receiving communities, because 1.2 million people were scattered all across the United States, with low-income African American single mothers being the most likely to be scattered the furthest. And so we were able to really document what supports were or were not available in those receiving communities. And so I think that's something about the book that was important, and that had to do with our own location, literal location as researchers, but also the lens we brought to the work. So thank you, Jackie, for your, again, bringing us all together in what we all agreed at the end of this effort was one of the most transformational of our careers. So thank you.
And thank you for that introduction. Like I mentioned, we'll get back to some of the things you talked about. But I wanted to move on to the next book that we have represented here in our collection. We have three co-authors who worked on the book Left to Chance, Hurricane Katrina, and the Story of Two New Orleans Neighborhoods. And I wanted to turn it over to Pam and Vern to start and just talk a little bit about that book and some of your takeaways.
Thanks, Anna. And I was going to talk a little bit about the overview of our book, Left to Chance. And I guess as we approached the project, we wanted to depart from kind of the application of an abstract model to study a disaster, stage models in particular, and focus instead on the particular, the local and lived experience of disaster. One of the inspirations would be Clifford Geertsen's distinction between, experience proximate and experience distant approaches. We wanted an experience proximate approach. We wanted to be on the ground. We wanted to discuss lived experience. We wanted to do interviews. We wanted to work with people over time rather than take a snapshot of disaster from above. So we were paying close attention to people's inner lives, their families, community, and then, of course, the aftermath of the disaster. And Pam's going to talk a little bit about methods, but I will mention one takeaway that I have from our research, and that is that obviously pre-existing, status, race, social class, available external resources are critical to the disaster experience and process of recovery. And in the end, an incredible amount of money was thrown at New Orleans, not always that efficiently or equitably distributed, but certainly when you look from the point of view that we did, in a kind of upheaval and sort of displacement that people experienced, people draw on their inner reserves, they draw on their family, they draw on their community to see their way through. And so we came out of this concluding that the process is distinctly nonlinear and often haphazard. And so the other side of disaster also, we quarreled some with the idea of recovery, feeling that instead some kind of notion of change or editing or transformation really is more relevant to understand people's experience of disaster. And with that, I'll let Pam talk a little bit about the methods and how we got there.
Pam, you're muted.
1 minute on methods and one takeaway. It was a wonderful process working with these two, Steve and Vern. We carefully identified leaders in 2 neighborhoods. We talked with them. We got lists of names. We did interviews in FEMA trailers. We did interviews in half destroyed houses. We did interviews in complete houses. We got to know these wonderful people in these neighborhoods. And then after we did an interview, we went back and talked to each other. Then when the transcripts came, we talked some more. It was a complete iterative process to come to the themes that dominated the book. My takeaway has always been from this experience was what we found was that even though there began to be aid available, and we were doing these interviews 07, 08, so there was beginning to be aid available, it was not accessible in a very easy way. So even as Vern said, they threw money at the storm, people couldn't access it. The random and arbitrary nature of aid, as Vern said, led us to view recovery differently. The recovery of Katrina is a slow and torturous process where very rarely were families and individuals able to plan about when help would come. And that made rebuilding, it made schools, it made the networks that Jackie talked about so difficult to rebuild. And so that led us to the name of this book, which is called Left to Chance, which I think is prophetic in these times.
Thank you. Yeah. Steve, I know you were a co-author as well, and we'll talk about your other book too, but I wanted to ask if you had anything to add about Left to Chance.
Yeah, just one thing. Thanks, Anna. I would add that the depths that were reached in our conversations with people in both neighborhoods, I think, was made possible largely by the visceral and emotive empathy that Pam and Vern brought to the discussions. Living with Katrina as they were talking to others who were living and struggling with the protracted aftermath created these moments of togetherness that kindled some amazing narratives. And that was confirmed for me by both Eli Anderson and Carol Stack. They were if they're amazed, I'm proud of what we did. And I think that in large part, again, it was the visceral and emotive empathy of Pam and Vern as they were going through this.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful thing to be able to bring to a
Mhm.
book. So, I want to keep us on track and switch over back to Lori. Lori is the author of a few books in the collection, but she's co-author on the book Children of Katrina. So I'm wondering if we could start with that and talk a little bit about that book.
Thank you. And before I do, I just want to say, Steve Kroll-Smith, you too embody visceral and emotive empathy. And thank you for giving a name to that and why it was so necessary to doing this work. So thank you. And so as Anna said, and I'm happy to be here today representing Children of Katrina on behalf of myself and my truly beloved co-author, Alice Fothergill, who is now a faculty member at the University of Vermont and is actually teaching a class right now, and so could not join us, but sends her love in regards to the team and to all of you who are here on this webinar. And I just want to say at the outset that Children of Katrina, which on the cover has one of the children's drawings, one of the many children who we collected drawings from after the storm. This book really grew out of a deep and abiding commitment to listening carefully and thoughtfully and with a whole heart to children's voices, and not just listening and recording those voices, but also trying to assure that those voices would contribute to conversations about interventions that affect young people's lives in current and future conditions. And before saying a little bit about the book and providing the two key takeaways, I wanted to say that just last night, just before midnight, Alice and I received an email from now Dr. Elliot White, who is an assistant professor of earth sciences at Stanford University, and he is also a child of Katrina. And he wrote us last night to say that his life when he was 12 years old was absolutely upended by this storm. And Dr. White shared with us, and I hope you will go to his website, Elliot White, Stanford University. He's absolutely brilliant, that what he lived through with Katrina became a turning point in his own young life and completely reshaped what he does, which is now he studies coastal climate change. And as a physical scientist, he connects physical science knowledge with the impacts on people. And so he wasn't able to join today because he was traveling, but I just wanted to uplift him and his story and acknowledge that hundreds of thousands of children's lives were upended in Hurricane Katrina. The Department of Education reported that nearly 400,000 children were displaced from their schools, start of a new school year in August of 2005. And there are countless stories to be told. And now those children of Katrina are, of course, adults living out their own lives. And so Alice and I, like many of the other authors on the Katrina Bookshelf, we launched this study just a month after Hurricane Katrina with the support of the Natural Hazard Center. Thank you, Kathleen Tierney, and the National Science Foundation with the support of the Quick Response Grant Program. And Alice and I traveled to the Gulf Coast, and many of you who are on here, too many to name, supported us, sponsored us, let us stay with you because there were not a hotel to be stayed in, nor did we want to take one away from a survivor or an emergency responder. So we traveled there right after the storm, but we spent 7 years studying and tracing the recovery trajectories of children. And in the course of this research, we interviewed or observed upwards of 650 children between the ages of 3 and 18, and they were largely reflective of the pre-storm population of Katrina in terms of race, gender identity, income status, and so forth. And we also formally interviewed over 100 adults, including parents, grandparents, teachers, emergency responders, and others who had a responsibility for caring for young people before, during, and after that disaster. And so what we present in the book is that because of the long-term nature of the study, we think it's one of the longest running ethnographies of children's recovery after disaster. We present 3 trajectories in the book, what we refer to as the declining trajectory, where children experience simultaneous and ongoing disruptions in all the spheres of their lives. the finding equilibrium trajectory, where after an initial period of decline, children with proper resources and support were able to either gain or regain or sustain a form of stability in their young lives. And then we had what we referred to as the fluctuating trajectory, which was a sort of a roller coaster ride, where children had this sort of mixed pattern of stable followed by unstable moments. And what kept these children from being on that declining trajectory was the presence of what we came to refer to as advocates or anchors in these young children's lives. And anchors were family members or direct friends in their social networks that helped to keep these children from being on the decline, or advocates who were oftentimes through formal recovery mechanisms that helped children. And so two key takeaways that I just want to share in brief is that first, one of the key messages that threads through the book is how important it is to listen to children, to really listen to them, to honor their stories, because they have so many stories to tell. And one of the things why this is really important to underscore over and over again is that much of the early work, important foundational work on children and disasters, actually drew on the reports of adults. And so it was either the reports of parents or teachers who were attempting to share what they knew about children's mental or physical health. And while those kinds of reports are important, one of the big things that Alice and I learned from children is oftentimes they were hiding their symptoms, their challenges, their problems from the adults in their lives because they didn't want to burden them. And so I think it's really important that we reach out and ethically, carefully, in developmentally appropriate ways learn from children. Second, one of the threads that also run through the book is that while children are oftentimes cast as vulnerable in disasters, and that's how they're oftentimes framed in emergency management practice, probably rightfully so, because children do have particular unique developmental, social, and educational needs that need to be tended to so that children aren't struck low by disaster. We also design this research in part to not just focus on children's vulnerabilities, but also to understand their incredible capacities. And that was largely in response to calls from founding sociologist Bill Anderson, who wrote a seminal paper where he called for sociologists in particular to understand more about children's strengths. And so in the book, we do present a typology of things that children did for themselves to help themselves heal, but also that they did for other young people as well as adults that really made a profound difference in that thing that, for better or worse, we do refer to as recovery. And so that's what Children of Katrina in sort of a nutshell is about. And thank you to those who have worked with children. I know there are many child advocates on the webinar today, and all respect and all love and all gratitude to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lori. I'm excited to talk more about some of your findings. I'll pass it over to Steve to talk about our next book in the collection, which is Recovering Inequality. And yeah, take it away, Steve.
Okay, so my interest, if you know the rest of the title, it has to do with Katrina and the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire. But my interest in San Francisco as a city worth knowing began in part with, Lawrence Powell's idea of New Orleans as an accidental city. And I have been in San Francisco many times, and it struck me as also a bit accidental. And when I started looking back in 1906 and thinking about Katrina in 2005, I came to the conclusion that both cities could be described as topographically precarious in all kinds of ways. A kind of geographic insecurity shapes both cities, Paris of the South and the Paris of the West. Both rest on precarious, again, landscapes. So San Francisco, get into the book, San Francisco lies between the San Andreas Fault and several less potent fault lines. In addition, it was and it still is a city that's prone to fires. And both those caused by surrounding bush and trees, but also some that are ignited in town and for one reason or another, and either human error or intentional. But it has a history of fires. New Orleans, of course, founded by the idea is founded by Bienville and 1718. And what Bienville did was anchor his boat on a rise, a natural rise, a natural levee, if you will, on the Mississippi River, and stood on that and looked at the river, then turned around and looked north, and all he saw was swamp. And the beginnings of a little bit of what appeared to be a stream, later called a bayou, now called Bayou St. John, that connected the Mississippi with what came to be called Lake Pontchartrain. So they end up filling in the swamp, excuse me, and creating an enormous amount of made land. And New Orleans gets on average, about 60 inches of rain a year. And it's shaped like, in lots of ways, and it's been described this way many times, like a bowl. And that water comes in, and the city sits somewhat below sea levels, just a little bit above sea level and at sea level. And that water tends to collect and stand. Thank goodness for neutral grounds that you can drive your car up. And so both cities are, again, topographically, precarious. And I found that interesting. And then I also found, when I got into it, that both cities began as kind of market centers, and so San Francisco was a port of call for ships going west in the Pacific, and New Orleans was port of call for ships getting out of the Mississippi and heading east to the Atlantic. And so both cities were generating income based on these processes. And both cities had, like all cities do, but this maybe in particular, it was kind of easy to see. They had that, what Polanyi called that organization, that he called them the market society. And if you unpack that term, what you get to is that market is an adjective and it's defining society. There are lots of societies that have markets, but the markets aren't in power to define the society. In a market society, what you want to look for is the way in which the bottom line, as it were, informs most of what's going on. And so I took that idea of the market society, and I began to look at the process of recovery in both cities. And the title, Recovering Inequality, gets to this notion that the idea for a lot of these folks, particularly the business class, the merchants, and the money class, if you will, was to get back to business as usual. Business as usual. Well, that business as usual created a lot of the fault lines that resulted in the uneven demographic consequences of both disasters. But nevertheless, that's the path that was taken. It was the path that was taken in 1906, and it's the path that was taken 2005. And I don't want to get Marxist about this. I know there was a lot more going on, but that helped me sort through the extraordinary recovery parallels in the recovery processes, but between both cities. the Red Cross got its start really in Katrina, and the Red Cross very quickly made this distinction between the worthy and the unworthy. And if you look at the Road Home program, you can see the ways in which people were parsed out in terms of what made them worthy, that is, what made them candidates for resources, and those that weren't. One of the primary distinctions, homeowners versus renters. And playing out these two catastrophes together, back and forth, toggling back and forth between them, helped clarify for me a lot of what's going on, both at the ideographic level, the individual level, and at the nomothetic level, the large aggregate level. And just consider one ideographic feature, and that is the way in which looting in both of these disasters, separated by roughly 100 years, became a prominent part of the city's government's response to the disaster. And what we know is that a good deal of looting is made up in all kinds of ways. And you can see somebody going into a grocery store that's been abandoned and has 4 or 5 feet of water in it, and coming out with a few cans of food to feed her family. And you can say, oh, that's looting. Or is it finding? Is it surviving? And again, going back to San Francisco, the way in which they created the looter, i.e. the Chinese person. Again, the parallels are astounding for me, and will remain so. And I guess 2 takeaways that I would have. Notes here. Sorry. Here it is. Two takeaways. One was I learned the importance of fiction in understanding disaster, or understanding lots of things about us as human beings. I mean, we tend to see fiction as made up, and it largely is, but a lot of it's based on historical happenings and goings on. Charles Dickens is a good example of that. The Bleak House and Hard Times. I mean, you can read that and you're wondering whether you may be reading an ethnography of the city at that point in time. And Richard Wright's story about the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927, and that story of Tom and his family, black family, coming back after the flood, and Mr. Burgess, this white guy, is saying, "Glad to see you, Tom. You got to get back and get to work." And Tom said, "There's nothing for us to go back to, and all I've got's a cow." And Mr. Burgess says, "Well, you owe $300 to $400 down at the store, and you got to pay me back, Tom." That kind of exchange. Yeah, it's fiction. He was making it up, but he was making it up in this historical context. So did Baudrillard, excuse me, in The Eyes of the Poor, where he talks about this well-to-do couple that goes into a cafe in Paris, and they look out the window and they see these poor, ragged people who could never get into that cafe staring at them. And the woman becomes very disconcerted about this and wants something done. And he writes a poem about this. Well, this really kindled for me lots of ideas and lots of ways of understanding what I was looking at. So one takeaway is my connection, and I'm going to keep that connection with fiction. Another that I mentioned previously was the need to toggle between the ideographic and the nomothetic when you're studying catastrophe or disaster, between the granular on the one hand and the complex and the general on the other, and create a kind of gavotte between those two, and you can generate an extraordinary understanding using people's words, people's experience, those folks who are living it, and then you're trying to make sense out of it. That exchange, or that need to go local and to go general, was something that I would say was a takeaway for me. I'll stop.
Thanks so much, Steve. That is such an interesting framework, and I appreciate you mentioning fiction as a inspiration point. Moving on to the last book we'll talk about today, we'll go back to Lori Peek to talk about The Continuing Storm. This is the last book published in the collection just a few years ago, and maybe you can give us a very brief introduction to that, and we'll move on to some deeper questions.
Absolutely, and thank you. And so, as Anna mentioned, the final book that was published on the 8-volume Katrina Bookshelf series, published by the University of Texas Press, was The Continuing Storm. And I want to again acknowledge Kai Erikson, who not only led this entire effort for more than 15 years after the storm. He also was the lead author on this book, and an extraordinary collaborator and extraordinary human being. And so just want to always acknowledge Kai. And we came together to write this book in part so it would indeed be the culminating book on the bookshelf, drawing together several of the threads that had appeared in the books published previously. But also at the heart of the book is really the argument that Katrina remains in sharp focus even 20 years after the disaster, because we think it is indeed the most telling disaster in our national experience. And because of everything that Katrina revealed in terms of the hard social truths regarding racism and racial inequality, sexism, class inequality, and what happens when core institutions in our society, rather than being cultivated, are broken down. And we think that Katrina revealed many of those lessons in such stark terms that they were worth accounting, but not just accounting with a looking back, but instead taking stock of those lessons so that we can hopefully learn from them and apply those lessons. Because as we all know, everyone on this webinar, everybody in this hazards and disaster community, the next big one is always just lurking right around the corner. And it's incumbent upon us to learn these lessons. And so The Continuing Storm is organized in 3 parts. Part 1 is called A Hurricane Known as Katrina, where we contrast the ways that Katrina was experienced along the shores of the Gulf, as well as in the city of New Orleans, where in many ways Katrina was less characterized as a hurricane and more as a failure of the levee system that was ostensibly to protect that city. Part 2 of the book is dedicated to locating Katrina in time and space. And part 3 is entitled Katrina as Human Experience, where we look at the before, during, and after of the disaster. And 2 takeaways of this. Number 1, I think that to truly understand Katrina, it's impossible to understand it only as a physical event, that really it is absolutely necessary to understand Katrina as what we refer to as sort of 3 successive blows. The before conditions, which really consisted of the centuries in the lead up to the storm that set the conditions for the disaster, ranging from slavery, institutionalized racism, and other forms of inequality that were so deeply embedded at the time of the storm. Then there's the during, the actual trauma of the storm, and then there's the after, which, as you've heard today, in many cases, the recovery became its own sort of disaster because of its protracted and unequal nature. And so we argue that in order to understand a complex disaster of this nature, that one of the things that must be taken into account is that in some ways it's like a concussion, that it's not additive, it's not 1 + 1 + 1. In many ways, these blows are multiplicative, just as with a concussion, that with each successive blow, it does more damage to the body and mind. Similarly, when there are these sorts of successive blows to the social system, we see these sort of catastrophic events unfold. And the second takeaway of this book, one of the things that we argue in the second section related to locating Katrina in time and space, is that we acknowledge fully and wholeheartedly that in order to make sense of disasters, to understand them, to study them, we must treat them as if they're bounded in time and space. That we must think about disasters as if they start at a particular time. Katrina made landfall at 6:03 a.m. on August 29, 2005, and it ended at what time. And so we must treat disasters as if they're bounded in time, but also in space. But one of the things that we think that Katrina can help us to think differently about is about how Katrina stretched those bounds, how we need to understand and think about the temporal dimensions of Katrina in entirely different sorts of ways. That just because the Stafford Act says that we can think about a disaster as 18 months on, we know that even 18 years on, many people were still saying that that storm was so present in their lives. So thinking about time as well as space differently, because Katrina as disaster did not only unfold in those cities and communities along the Gulf Coast that were struck most violently, it also unfolded all across these United States due to the displacement. So with that, thank you again, Anna, for inviting us all and preparing us, and now turning the mic back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of you for those great introductions to the book, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the things you all touched on. I do want to acknowledge just really quickly that there are 8 books. We only have 5 represented here, so I'm dropping in the chat the other 3, and encourage you to check those out as well. Those authors just couldn't be here with us today for scheduling conflicts or things like that, so definitely worth checking out. We have touched on this all in some of your introductions, but I do want to take a moment to just acknowledge like how the Katrina Bookshelf came together. It's clearly a monumental undertaking, and both Jackie and Lori talked a little bit about how it came together, but I'm wondering if we could just briefly go over that again, because it is a story about the emergence and evolution of this huge research undertaking.
Well, I can talk. Go. I'm sorry, Jackie. Go ahead.
Did you mean you want to talk about the research collective, or you want to talk about, yes, is that what you want to talk?
We'll maybe we could start with the Displaced Research Collective, as I know that was the first book, and then we could talk about the evolution of the Katrina Bookshelf beyond that. And
Yeah. Well, I could start with that, Lori, if you want me to. I'm looking for my notes. So I don't know if this is the question that when you asked Jackie, you weren't a disaster researcher, but you got involved with this. And no, I wasn't, and really am not a disaster researcher. My interest in this stemmed really just from the heart and watching the dislocation of so many African Americans in New Orleans. And I'll never forget, I was with my co-author on another book, and we walked in and we turned on the TV, and I couldn't believe my eyes about the traffic, going out. And I thought, how will they ever recover? I had no sense of how to make sense of that. So, and I assumed, this was late in the day, right? This was when folks who maybe didn't have the resources to leave or weren't sure they were going to leave started leaving, and it was many Black and brown people, and it really just broke my heart, and I thought I have to figure this out. And then I had this idea. Well, I knew that it was like this bomb dropped in New Orleans, especially. And, I'm sure you've all seen it, where the individuals who were dislocated just went all around. And I thought, how do we keep track? How do we know how they're doing? They're all over the place here. And I called Kai and I said, I want to do a map of where the evacuees, displaced, internally displaced people have landed, and I want to study how that has been. And of course, we know now that they moved multiple times. He's, he's so great. He's like, let's do it. And I think I take credit for introducing Lori to Kai, but I'm not sure. So that was sort of, I wanted to, it's something like deep in my heart came out. And then the sociological piece of it was how do we make sense of this sociologically? And again, as I said, I was really struck by the suddenness of the dislocation and watching how it was managed really badly. And my book, which I haven't published, and I don't know if I'm going to, studied a few kin networks from leaving New Orleans to arrival in Houston and then back in New Orleans. But I just wanted to read you, and I don't really know the audience here, but just a little bit from one of the interviews. Frankly, because our research collective was so integrated, I don't know if this is my respondent or not, but so let me read you what she said. A lot of people were on the loose, a lot of people asking about their families, a lot of people were running loose, babies, fathers. I have friends and family in Atlanta now too. They weren't with us in the house. They couldn't get out at the same time. They didn't have nowhere to go, and they were shipped to a different place. So many people shipped so far. It's hard because you were shipped to places and you didn't want to be that far. You didn't know anybody. You don't know where you are. It's hard. So there's obviously an incredible amount to unpack here, in addition to being shipped and feeling being shipped. And I know my respondents felt that way. But this point of, your networks, your whole social organization really collapsed. And I think her comment, "You don't know where you are," really says it all about what happens in these sudden dislocations where networks are not kept intact. And that was one of my main recommendations. You have to find a way to keep networks together because, first of all, they're survival networks, and you need the women in them to keep them running and at capacity. So I'm not sure I'm getting it to everything I jotted down. I did want, for sure, this to be a kind of critical intersectional feminist project, since I was interested in issues of power. And I also noted, when I started digging around, I didn't know this literature at all, that in the literature I saw, I didn't see much said about women. And I was like, wait a minute, is this the 1960s? I couldn't believe it. Now, maybe I was looking at the wrong things. But Elaine Enerson, I think, did some beautiful work. So I got very interested in, let's look at what women do in these situations and the burdens placed on them and really the importance they play in keeping social organization together. I guess I'll say something about the network. I think it was built mostly by a snowball sample. So Lori, I can't remember if you came in just after Kai, but I didn't know these researchers. So people, volunteered other names and people jumped in. I think we had some who were not disaster researchers, were, kind of regular sociologists and never thought about disaster research. And I guess I'll say it here since we're kind of running out of time. The research network, I'll be curious what you all think about this, but was the most supportive and wonderful research collaboration I've ever done. I mean, I could tear up now because I love those women. And we spent many years and many really difficult times together. But there, of course, were divisions. And one that came out was we were pretty deep into it. And some researcher from New Orleans, I don't know who it was, Pam, Rachel, could be anybody, finally let out that she found it a little difficult to take those of us who were from the outside, who just kind of dropped in, who weren't living with the situation, who didn't know the city, and I naively, I was like, wow, yeah, that makes sense. So that was one moment of inequality and power, and speaking the unspoken. That was really powerful about this network. We also had, I'll give you one last anecdote quickly. So a group of evacuees came up to Columbia, Missouri, and I organized my department, women's studies, to do things with them. My family got very close, and then my synagogue, I said, we need to raise money because, of course, there wasn't enough money from these government or NGOs. And my main respondent said she needed a car. And I said, okay, we'll raise money for a car. And the synagogue raised money for a car. And she came to me and she showed me a humongous van that she bought, which I understood serves her needs. But I thought, oh my God, how is she going to afford the gas? I mean, I don't look very good in this story. So I called my colleagues at the synagogue. I'm like, I'm not going to say that's a stupid mistake, but I mean, she didn't have nickels to run together. So in the meantime, I just, I let it go. But it was like a moment of another power inequality. Like, who am I to evaluate what she's getting? She's serving her family. It's going to be up to her to find the money to support it. But there were just these fraught moments like that that came about in the network. So we could all talk about many, many more, but that's why it was such an instructive, fabulous undertaking.
Thank you so much, Jackie. I want to switch, just keep moving on with some of our questions, just because we have so many great ones to get to, and we're, as you mentioned, running out of time. And I wanted to ask Pam and Vern, bring you into the conversation because I understand you were living in New Orleans at the time of Katrina, and that you still live there today. And so I think your perspectives here are really valuable. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your experience during Katrina in terms of what motivated you to focus on long-term recovery. And I think that's especially important because we know that prior to Katrina, that was the least studied phase of disaster. So I think there's a lot to learn in terms of focusing on that. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that comes up in your book.
I'll start, Vern, if that's okay.
Please.
My story of Katrina is much like the stories in our book. Gutting the house, taking debris to the curb, the uncertainty of when the aid would come. But a couple of things were different. One of them was this research collective. And I was thinking about this yesterday when Vern and Steve and I were talking, doing these books and this research and rebuilding my home were co-occurring, and it deepened both. And I was really grateful to Kai and Steve and Lori and Jackie who put this together, because it really made a difference in my life. To be with these women, to be with Vern and Steve and Kai and learn, and then go back and write an interview. So that was one thing that was very different. And the second thing is that while my house was torn down to the outside walls and the roof, I stood, and inside everything but two things were gone. I stood in privilege in the storm. I stand in privilege in the storm. And part of that is because of my training, and my husband is an attorney. And so what we could do is navigate FEMA, Road Home, Red Cross, every system that was difficult, we could navigate. And I really know what that means in the city of New Orleans to stand in privilege in a disaster. And the third thing for me that is about long-term recovery in many ways is Jackie's work really writes about how these social networks, especially in low-income neighborhoods, were crucial to people's survivals and how they were fractured in the storm. But what was born for us, and I think Vern will talk about this too, is a community of help.
Yeah.
We called it Sunday at Pam and Ed's. So every Sunday for 5 months, and Shirley Laska, if you're on there, you were one. You showed up with your mask and sat on my porch. And Vern came down after he worked on his house. We would have as many as 20 people in our house on a Sunday helping us gut. And then 18 months later, when we moved back home, some of those same people came and helped us move. But all over the country, for us, people sent us money, they sent us clothes, they sent kitchenware. And that pro-social behavior, that community that we built, happened all over the city in different ways as people could. And that really is an untold story of how we reformed those networks. Mr. Vern?
My brother-in-law's family and my family left before the storm for Houston and ended up staying there until November when the power was restored. During that period, I rounded up a couple of guys from Tigertown. We would drive down and gut the house and work, and then I would take them back home. And as soon as the power was restored, we moved back into our house, which was on the second floor, but the first floor was flooded. So that project took about a year, greatly aided by my friend Ula, who's a Swedish guy who had evacuated to Missouri, and he needed a place to stay. So I said, well, I got a gutted basement, you could stay. And he said, great, and we got after it. And again, my neighbor's a plumber. Guy down the street turned my power on way before the energy company would have done it. But probably most importantly was the community of people. And Pam, of course, was one of them, but also a bunch of the neighborhood friends who ended up evacuated to the same apartment complex in Baton Rouge that a friend of ours had helped line up. And so we would meet there most every night after whatever we were doing, have a brew and talk it over and commiserate and decide what we could do for each other the next day. And those people were all rebuilding their houses along with me and Pam, and so they're family now. And that was the biggest thing for me, is people who are friends, neighbors, good friends, are family. And my family of origin is pretty much gone and fallen apart. And so this is it. And so that was what happened for me. And then personally, the kind of experience of finding capacity I wasn't sure I had. I was telling Pam and Steve, learned how to operate a jackhammer, which was necessary, but I'm sure it took something out of me. And that was kind of how I think a lot of people found themselves. And so it's a shit ton of work to go through a disaster. And it's emotionally and physically really draining. And it's a long process. And so no matter how effectively resources are made available, it takes a long time to really get this stuff moving and organized and done. And so sometime in 06, we were pretty much back with, living in our house, but the city was still in really difficult shape. And so I really appreciated getting involved in research. But just to finish up, the process is long, hard, and arduous. And so your study has to be, your research has to be long, and it has to follow people over time. And you got to look into the relationships that people build, that they lose. And then the stuff about health, I mean, people we were working with in our longitudinal study were passing away. And we knew several of them were hastened in their demise by the experience that Jackie very nicely described it, Lori, because it just takes so much out of you. And we had a guy that was driving an hour and a half every day to get his house and then working for Bull Brothers Construction on the side. And so he had a heart attack, you know, after about 9 months, and he survived it. But these things show up over time, and obviously a lot of it never really leaves you. And so that's some of my.
Yeah, thank you so much to both of you for sharing those personal stories along with all your research efforts. I just want to acknowledge that we're kind of running out of time, so I want to get to some of our one of the meatier questions I guess we have that I want to make sure we have time to address is when we talk about looking forward. We're 20 years on from Hurricane Katrina now, and we know that it revealed a lot of weaknesses about preparedness, response, recovery infrastructure. And so I wanted to ask, informed by all of your research, what were some of the key policies or practices in emergency management and planning and the way we prepare for storms that have changed over the last 20 years? And I'm hoping maybe we could start with Lori in terms of with regards to children, because I know that's such a unique population and a lot has changed in that space.
Thank you. And I just want to thank everybody who's putting so many excellent resources, comments, stories in the chat. You all are incredible. And just one thing I wanted to pick up on here, that with this bookshelf, just how important having this collective has been, as you're hearing, emotionally, personally, to the intellectual project and to the ethics of doing the work. And so I just wanted to say that, and also acknowledge and uplift the other outstanding resources that are being shared. So thank you. And Anna, thank you for asking this question about sort of what has changed, where are we going, and asking me to speak specifically about children. But given the moment that we are in and what has even happened this week, I just actually wanted to begin by encouraging anybody on this call who hasn't read essentially the Katrina Manifesto that was released by nearly 200 FEMA employees, that I think does an outstanding job of taking stock of what changed in the aftermath of FEMA, or in the aftermath of Katrina, specifically at the Federal Emergency Management Agency, but also what is underfoot right now that may be undermining some of those serious changes that occurred in the aftermath of the storm. And so I really wanted to recommend that if anybody has not read that, I think it's very important to read. And then very briefly, in response to this question, again, thank you for asking about children. So there were many changes in the aftermath of Katrina that happened in the policy, but also in the practice space in response to the harm and suffering that occurred to children. For the first time in our nation's history, there was actually a national commission on children in disasters that was drawn together at the behest of President George W. Bush, who recognized the failures around supporting, protecting, and serving children. And so this National Commission of Experts on Children and Disasters came together, and they made over 100 recommendations of policies and practices that needed to change. That report was released in 2008. In the years that followed, the extraordinary organization Save the Children tracked which of those recommendations had been taken up. And unfortunately, not nearly as many as should have, given the importance to protecting children's health and well-being. But that was a really important, I think the effort is important to highlight, that we must take stock and understand, but then we also must monitor and measure whether the recommendations are being taken up. Over 5,000 children were separated from their caregivers and loved ones in Katrina. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children both took on that cause to help reunite those children who had been separated, and also has prompted much policy change, as have other organizations, incredible organizations like Child Care Aware, other groups that are working specifically on behalf of kids. And so I think one of the policy changes, I'm going to wrap back to FEMA as I end this, that FEMA also did several things in the aftermath of Katrina in response to protecting and uplifting children, including establishing a FEMA Youth Corps, a FEMA Preparedness Council that was populated with youth leaders, and also put a children in disasters expert sitting in that national organization to really help oversee efforts on behalf of children. So I think there are all kinds of examples like that that we need to look to and see where change happened, but also to doggedly pursue the changes that did not occur, that were recommended based on evidence, and the things that are being rolled back, to not let those be rolled back without raising up our voices about why they're so necessary. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think I'll actually use that last sentiment about things that have been left behind or things that might be being rolled back to go into our last question. I apologize that we won't get to a full Q&A, but I think it's really important to have all of you weigh in on this. As has been mentioned multiple times in this conversation, we know that the next disaster is always right around the corner, and especially in this time when things are being rolled back and when climate change is contributing to more frequent and intense storms. I want to really look at what we can learn from Katrina that can help us prepare for whatever is coming next. And I'm wondering if you could each just take a minute to maybe give one takeaway or one sentiment that we should be thinking about.
What I've seen in Louisiana since Katrina is a growth of knowledge by practitioners about mitigation, including elevation, drainage issues, all of those things. Part of my research has been interviewing parish leaders and parish floodplain managers. And I've really seen this growth of knowledge about these very mitigation issues, not the big issues such of climate change and sea level rise, but of what to do. And they really took it to heart and grew in knowledge. But what I'm afraid of looking forward, and I wrote the sentence for this, there's great changes that were made, but what I'm afraid of is we face a hurricane season and many other disasters in a political climate unknown in my lifetime. And what I really think is how much danger we're in. And that's what, as Lori said, that's what we have to work towards.
Maybe, yeah, I was going to say, Jackie, you can.
I was just going to add, I mean, the structural inequality is, at the base of so much of this disaster crisis. And I don't see us heading anywhere to address that, and it's big, it's huge, it's everything. But we can do these other intermediate steps. And I don't know. I mean, I was just up in the Pacific Palisades a couple days ago, and I mean, it's bad. The other thing is we keep using the word resilience, and I think that just reproduces the notion that this is an individual responsibility, that the state, get off your feet, pull up your bootstraps. And people celebrate that, including people who suffered terribly. So it's a judgment put on them. It's a cop-out, all kinds of problem with that word. And I know that others have written about this, but I would just be careful about using it.
I think one thing that would be worth considering is going back to 2005, going back to Katrina and New Orleans and the surrounding Gulf Coast, and asking ourselves the question, what would the response be today? And I think, Lori, that it's centers like yours that we need desperately to be a kind of front line in pointing out how we are in no way, shape, or form ready for the next catastrophe and
Yeah.
what we would need to do to get there. And yeah, so okay, I'm done.
Yeah, I would just chime in at the same kind of communities and networks that people live in and that they've forged in the context of Katrina or other experiences. They're forged in struggle. And I think the moment calls for kind of mass movement struggle that's built from the local level and experience. And it's on so many fronts, and it's so important. That is all I can see to really give hope and a place to put energy. And best of luck and thanks to everybody.
And I guess my last takeaway in our last 20 seconds is data, data, data. Without data, we cannot characterize the patterns, the social and economic and racial patterns that we've been talking about today. And data are actually absolutely critical. Louisiana led the way during the COVID-19 pandemic in saying, this isn't an equal opportunity pandemic. Let's look at the data and see where there are demographic disparities. And so everything that we can do to continue to champion rigorous data and its use and the use of evidence to advance just and equitable preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation. That's what we stand for. Thank you.
Can I just ask, Lori, what does the funding picture look like right now
For
collecting these kinds of data? And
yeah,
is
so
it
I
as
know we're
dismal
close.
as?
Yeah, so I know we're close to the end of this, but
Sorry,
it's a
sorry.
hard, no,
Another
it's just a
conversation.
hard, it's a hard question, but I think the more we can uplift our voice about what research is for and where it matters, and the more we can champion that importance and where data can be used again to make a difference in all of these aspects that you also beautifully articulated, I think that's critical right now, in addition to
Okay.
all the other many things. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
All of you for joining us today. And just as I mentioned, this will be recorded and up on our website first thing next week. I've also had a lot of questions about resources shared in the chat. I will pull everything from the chat and make sure it gets up on our page. We also do have, many of you have mentioned documentaries, books, things. We did put together a page of just some of the stuff that is out there, some of the things you've mentioned that you can find on our website, that has media and some of our scholarship from the Natural Hazard Center about Katrina. But I will certainly go through your suggestions and pull some of those to add to that page, so it will be evolving. And you can always email us with more suggestions. But thank you so much. I know we only scratched the surface, but I just extend my gratitude to all the authors here who are able to share some lessons from this turning point, and really appreciate all the folks who are able to do this.
Love to Kai. That's
Yeah.
my parting
Yeah.
words.
You know.
And thank you, Anna and
Thank
Lori.
you.
Thank you, Anna and
Thank
Lori.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Great to
Go,
see
bye.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.